Good morning.
We're glad for the few that are here. Maybe there's a few joining us online today too. Um, New face today, obviously. With the new year, our teaching quarters have changed over. So um, I'll be teaching up here this quarter. Heather. Um, Thank you to those that taught last quarter. Created the parable unit with us up here. That was enjoyable. Hopefully, we all got a lot out of that. Yeah, we'll be starting a new lesson here today for the coming quarter. Before we get into that lesson, the sick list is a long one. And these are just ones off the top of our heads that we are aware of. And looking around at some of the empty pews, I'm guessing there are others. Good morning. Jane is home not feeling well today. Little Carver is not feeling well. Earache and just not comfortable little guy. Pam, Carl won't be here today. Pam will be having knee surgery coming up here in a week and a half or so. And her doctor instructed her to stay inside in the meantime. So with all the sickness going around, they don't want to risk her being sick and not being able to do the surgery. So keep Pam in your prayers. I don't believe that they are sick necessarily, but preventative measures. The Tracy family is pretty much Robert Carey's daughter, Carey Jo, her husband, and the kids are all wiped out with something. So keep them in your prayers, and at the same time, Carey's dad, Royce Sarton, is not well. And he is in Colorado, near Lori, right? So Kara is planning a trip out there later this month, but acknowledges that may need to change if he doesn't improve. So anyhow, keep Royce also in your prayers. Yeah. Her daughter, Carey Jo's family, and her dad, but not her. Okay, thank you. The Coxes have been dealing with it here. Brannigan, Sean, maybe some of the others. So keep the Cox family in prayers. The Aldridges have been having their health issues for some time now. Keep both Lori and Jean in your prayers. Mark's kids, grandkids are all under the weather. Most of you sitting here know the McNeil family. Bob, Peg, Joellen, the other Peg. I think we're all having significant issues. So continue to keep the McNeil family in your prayers if you would. Jesse is already heading back to college here this weekend. Sadie will be heading back this weekend, I think. So keep them specifically in all the college kids in your thoughts and prayers as well. Not seeing any of our older group here today, so we'll have to check in to see if Smith Bowers, Kathy, already mentioned James, not feeling well. Maxine, keep all those in your thoughts and prayers. Today is open house at Wynn's. She's invited us there between the hours of 12 and 4 today. She's down here at the Mid Apartments, just at the bottom of the hill. So if you are able of the mind. Stopped in for a visit with Gwen this afternoon. Next week is our fellowship meal for January. In a bit since we took a break for the holidays for that, but plan on joining us next Sunday. Anything else that we need to mention? Anything about the ladies' retreat? I know the ladies are.
I think we're going the first weekend of March.
Okay. So not written in stone, I guess, but it sounds like the first earlier date. Wednesday nights, I need to double check with Jacob that he was planning to start a class. I don't know why I can't keep this thing on today. That's the plan, unless something has changed on his end. So yes, we will be starting back our Wednesday night class again. We took a couple weeks off for the holidays for that. That should be back in order here this Wednesday as well. The ladies are starting back tomorrow again, right? So things are picking back up again here. All right. If there's nothing else, we will have a prayer and then get into our lesson this morning. Let's bow. Dear Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for our blessings. We thank you for the opportunity that we have to be together this morning. Thankful for each individual that's here. Thankful for each family that's represented. We just pray for your blessings on each one of us. In the new year that we will be strengthened to rejuvenated to not just continue to serve you, but to serve you better than what we have in the past. We pray for your blessings on this church. There are many that are sick. Pray for your blessings on that. Just pray that we are able to encourage, serve one another, and just help each other in our roads to living lives that are pleasing to you. We just pray for your blessings on our Bible study time and our worship time this morning, that we speak truth and that we're all gained from it, and that through our worship to you, that we put you in your proper place, and we also are edified by our time. We thank you for Jesus, his living and dying for us, and making all things possible for us. And thank you for that. It's in his name that we pray. Amen. All right. As I have said, probably every time I've taught or started a new series, oftentimes coming up with the topic is the hardest thing for me. And once I get that nailed down, things fall into place. That's kind of been the opposite experience this time for me. I've been kind of chewing, dwelling on something for many months now, and keep changing directions or tweaking things, and so it's still a work in progress. So where we're going to end up by the end of this quarter. I started off, thinking of, and still am going to be looking in John chapters 13 through 17, I think it is. Jesus' words to his disciples following, the Lord's, the Last Supper, and in between that time and in his arrest. A few chapters worth of discussion, teachings that he has there. And I was thinking as we look back at some of the things that we have accomplished here in the recent couple of years anyhow, we've had teachings on the Sermon on the Mount, and Craig just did teachings on parables, And we've had series on Jesus' final words, things that he said from the cross and lessons we learned from that. I've looked at Jesus' teachings on faith through some of the encounters that he had. Happy birthday. And anyhow, what I got to thinking is, maybe I was going to look at some of Jesus' teachings that maybe fall in some of the gaps there that aren't necessarily parables, that aren't necessarily found in the Sermon on the Mount, or and that's where I started with that John chapter 13 thing. And in the meantime, I've come across a couple of other teachings that kind of fell into that category. So I'm starting off today with what you see on the screen, rather than starting initially in John chapter 13. And this interest was piqued in me back at Thanksgiving weekend. My brother Jeff shared some thoughts on specifically the first one there, the feeding of the 4,000. But it prompted me to start thinking about some of the lessons that we can learn from these occasions that we see on the screen here. Now, first of all, I have to admit, there was a time years ago, I'd read an article or something, that the writer was proposing that these two incidents were really the same incident, that they're just, the details are just so close that this couldn't happen twice, that, when the writers were referencing this, they were generalizing, they were estimating, so 4,000, 5,000, 5 loaves, 7 loaves, it was really the same episode that just happened to be referenced differently. I don't believe that, and I think there's lots of evidence to support the fact that these are two separate events that occurred. Anybody have any thoughts as to how we would know that these two miraculous events, very similar events, admittedly, details, some of the details for both that are similar, there's large crowds following Jesus, and he's teaching in a somewhat remote area in both cases. And there's questions about how we're going to feed all these people, right? And very similar things. There's a few loaves and a few fish, and Jesus is able to feed the multitude of people with leftovers even, in both cases. So there are a lot of similarities in these two events, but what are some facts that we would be able to point to that would allow us to know that these aren't the same events that were just kind of brushed over? Any thoughts on that? Go ahead, Susan. That's a good thought. What would be the reason to doubt that this would happen twice? If he could do it one time, he could do it twice and 3 times or 4 times, or as often as he would want. Good point. Any other thoughts? Very good. And that, exactly. And that's an excellent point that, in fact, All 4 Gospels include the feeding of the 5,000. In fact, I did not double check this, but I read a couple of sources that said that this miracle, the feeding of the 5,000, is the only miracle other than Jesus' resurrection that is recorded in all 4 Gospels. So the feeding of the 5,000 we find in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But Matthew and Mark both also include the feeding of the 4,000. If it didn't happen twice, why would they record it twice and record it differently each time with different details? So that's an excellent point, and probably the big one for me. It doesn't make sense that Matthew or Mark would record both of these occurrences if it was the same event. If we dig around each of these occurrences as well, we also find that they occurred in different areas. The feeding of the 5,000 should have been right up here in the northern part of Galilee, somewhere around Bethsaida. And the feeding of the 4,000, we're told, Jesus had gone to the area of the Decapolis. And Decapolis, you can see that's where it is. But really, Decapolis is kind of this whole southeastern region right there below the Sea of Galilee. It's called the area of the Decapolis because there are 10 cities there. 9 of the 10 are on the east side of the Jordan River. Here's the Jordan River that goes from the Sea of Galilee down, and Jerusalem's all the way down here somewhere, if I'm not mistaken. But all nine of the 10 cities are to the east of that Jordan River, with the one being right here, just on the western edge of it. So that area, the Decapolis, is where Jesus was when he fed the 4,000. So the details about this put him in 2 different locations when these events happen as well. So when we put all this together, just the sheer common sense portion of it that Susan brought up, to the point that Jeff brought up about Matthew and Mark recording both, and the fact that when we look into the details of both a little bit closer, they occur in 2 different regions. These were 2 separate events that had many similarities. And the reason that I'm talking about them today is I think they have similar lessons that are being taught. When I read about miraculous events or encounters that Jesus had with a person, we know that John says at the end of his book that there were many things that Jesus did that were not recorded for us, right? In fact, he says if we tried to record it all, the books in all the world couldn't hold this all. So Jesus did so much that we don't know about. So there must be reasons why the things that are recorded for us were recorded for us, right? Why did he record this event and not what happened the next day? Because I'm sure something equally baffling and amazing happened the following day and following Jesus around his life. Why wasn't that recorded? Why did all 4 gospel writers decide that the feeding of the 5,000 was an important enough thing for us to know about, that they wanted to include that? But only 2 of them decided the feeding of the 4,000 is something that I want people to remember and know about and learn about. There's got to be reasons there. And I don't know that I have all those reasons. But looking at what happens after both of these events, I think there's some cool things that we can read. So Mark chapter 8. Let's start there. Mark chapter 8. And I'm not going to read through the whole beginning of the chapter that details Jesus feeding. This is the 4,000 one, which, by the way, seems to have occurred second. The feeding of the 5,000, I believe, happened first. This would have been the second of these two miraculous feedings. And like I said, it was that in that area in southeast of the Sea of Galilee. But in the first several verses of this, we have the description of this feeding. And basically the details that we need to know is that Jesus used 7 loaves to feed approximately 4,000 men. And after he used these 7 loads to feed these 4,000, they gathered up how many baskets of leftovers? Anybody remember? 7, okay? This is one of those lessons I think it was Jacob, when I told him I was going to be teaching on this. If KB was here, he was going to take this lesson and go with it, because he likes the meanings behind numbers, it seems, right? He likes to latch on to that. So, but I believe there are some meanings behind these numbers, and Jesus is going to point that out here in the coming verses. But in this one, there was 7 loaves that feeded 4,000, and there was 7 baskets that were leftovers, that were picked up at the end. And the other occasion, there was what? 5 loaves that feeded 5,000, and there were 12 baskets that were gathered up afterwards. So keep that in mind as we continue reading here. Verse 10 Mark ends this, says, "Immediately he entered the boat with his disciples and came to the district of Dalmanutha." And if I'm not mistaken, that's kind of one they're not real sure where it is, although there is some evidence that has been uncovered that it was a town, a city near Magdala, which is Mary Magdalene, would be from Magdala. But right there in that area of Magdala is where they believe this town of Dalmanutha would have been. In verse 11, "And the Pharisees came out and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him." There's another similarity. When we go back to one of the accounts and we read about the feeding of the 5,000, there is also, immediately after that, the Pharisees come to him asking for a sign. And it's like, what do you need to see, people? Yeah, Craig has been talking about these parables for 3 months now, and it's constantly, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. He who has eyes, these people, they had eyes in their head, right? They could see the stuff that was happening, but it was never good enough. It was, he just fed 5,000 people, and they go asking for a sign. Here, he just fed 4,000 people. The 7 little loaves and a few small fish, it's described, and they immediately ask for a sign. Some people are never going to be satisfied, I've realized, right? And that's unfortunate. But they're seeking from a sign from heaven to test him. And I like this one. My wife probably doesn't because I'm guilty of this a lot. Verse 12. And sighing deeply in his spirit, he said, "Why does this generation seek for a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign shall be given to this generation." And leaving them, he again embarked and went away to the other side. So they're going back and forth across the sea here, it seems. Now, this isn't a huge body of water, but it's still a few miles across, I believe, if you can see the scale up there at the top. In fact, one of the references is going to mention to them having rowed 3 or 4 miles in that particular instance, but they're going to go back across the sea, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, they're going to end up over here near Capernaum after this, but it doesn't really matter. In verse 14, they had forgotten to take bread and did not have more than 1 loaf in the boat with them. And he was giving orders to them, saying, "Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." And they began to discuss with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus was aware of this and said to them, "Why do you discuss the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet see or understand? Do you have a hardened heart? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? And how many baskets full of broken pieces you picked up?" They said to him, 12. "And when I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets full of broken pieces did you pick up?" And they said to him, 7. And he was saying to them, "Do you not yet understand?" Okay, we're going to stop right there for a second and go back. The big reason we started off with, how do we know that both of these events were the same or weren't the same event, that they were 2 separate events? Well, Jesus himself tells us that he did 2 separate events, right here. And that's like the story I've heard preachers trying to justify that the account of Jonah and the large fish, well, that didn't actually happen. It was just kind of a story to teach us a lesson. Well, then why did Jesus himself reference the account of Jonah if it wasn't an actual story, right? So there's many things that Jesus himself will reaffirm for us if we just listen to him. But here, Jesus tells us specifically, there was 2 times this happened. You remember when I fed the 5,000? How many loaves did I use? And how many baskets did you pick up? Now, this seems kind of strange, doesn't it? Jesus had just said, "Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." That's his lesson that he's wanting to tell them. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And because he uses the word leaven or yeast or whatever your version might use, because he uses that word, their minds are immediately thinking about actual bread, right? The fact that they messed up, the fact that they didn't have bread with them on the boat, other they had 1 loaf, but what's 1 loaf going to do for, at least 13 of them that are on this boat? Their minds immediately go to the fact, oh, we didn't bring bread. He's upset that we don't have enough food. So they're debating about that, and Jesus overhears it. That's not what I'm saying here. This has nothing to do with the fact that you didn't bring bread, right? I would have thought that we put that to rest. When you watched me feed 5,000, and watch me feed 4,000. I could certainly feed the 13 of us with that one loaf if needed be, right? So he's a little upset. Hopefully not as upset as he was with the Pharisees when he sighed deeply when they asked him for a sign. But he's not happy with his disciples either. He again goes to that phrase that he says oftentimes. But he's asking this in the question matter. Even you guys, do you guys not see and hear? Right? I know the Pharisees don't. I know a lot of people I've been teaching don't. But even you, do you still not get it? So then he continues. This answer to the question. When he's not questioned, but the statement, when he says, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod, he gives them some clues. What he's talking about. Down in verse 19. When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets did you pick up? 12. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many baskets did you pick up? 7. And he's like, do you get it now? Now, if you're like me, you're probably saying, no, I don't get it. What does this have to do with being wary of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod? The fact that you fed a bunch of people and we picked up a bunch of baskets afterwards, what does that have to do with it? And I think the answer is there in those numbers. Jewish people would have read this looking for meaning behind the numbers. And what are these numbers telling us? Well, let's start with the 5,000. The number 5 to a Jewish person, and still today, apparently, but the number 5 is very much representing the law, right? There are 5 books of the law. They call it what? Their fancy word for the first 5 books of the Old Testament is the Pentateuch, meaning 5, right? So, 5 very much pointed them to the law, right? The Jewish law. There was 5 loaves. There was 5,000. And then they picked up how many baskets? Well, they picked up 12. 12 also to a Jewish person would have been a very, very nationalistic look at the Jewish people, because there were 12 tribes of Israel, right? So to a Jewish person, these numbers 5 and 12 would have been very much looking at the Jewish culture, the Jewish nation, right? Not surprising that feeding of the 5,000 occurred, we said right up there, which was a very Jewish area. The 5,000 people plus all their, we know there was more than 5,000. There's 5,000 men in that occasion. Those would have been almost all Jews. That would have been in that gathering. Okay? When he says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees were all about getting to decide what was right with the law, right? Not just what was right with the law, but in an extension of that, who was right with the law, right? The people that weren't following the law, crossing the T's, dotting the I's, then those people were out, right? In their minds. And that's what they were all about. In fact, back in verse 11, the Pharisees had come to him wanting to test him, And that's what Jesus brought up about here. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. In the Pharisees' mind, if you weren't the Jew of Jews, right? If you weren't not just a Jew, but weren't also following that law to the letter, then you were out. You were excluded, right? And I think that's what Jesus is saying about the leaven of the Pharisees. When he is saying, beware of this. This is not how it should be. And how do we get that? Well, because he continues on, the feeding of the 4,000, 4 to a Jew is exactly the opposite view of that. When they talked about the 4 corners of the world, they were talking about the world, inclusive, everybody, not just their Jewish nation. They were talking about the 4 corners of the world, everybody, all. And when they saw the number 7. Now, the number 7, this is the one that was a little confusing for me, because when I see the number 7, I always think of completeness, right? Something that is done totally. It took 7 days to create the world, and God did it completely and totally. And I think there is some aspect of that in the Jewish culture that they think along those lines. But learning, studying through this more, there is another meaning that Jews will take with the number 7. And again, it's associated not with their Jewish brethren. It's all-encompassing the world. Because when they went into the promised land, there were 7 nations that they were supposed to wipe out and annihilate, to take that over. So that 7 became to them kind of a symbol of, again, everybody else, the outsiders, the people that aren't part of the Jewish nation, culture. Okay? So when Jesus is telling his disciples here, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, that leaven, I think, is that idea that this is only for us. And it's only for the people that cross the T's, dot the I's, do the letter of the law, and it's only for the Jews. Well, how does Herod come into this? Well, remember, Herod was the real king of the Jews, right? He was under the Roman authority, however. And how did Herod keep his position? How did he keep his power? Well, he allowed Roman influence, right? He allowed the outsiders to have influence in the Jewish matters. Why? Because he knew if he didn't, the Romans would just oust him and put somebody else in his spot, right? So he allowed outside influence to come in. But Jesus is saying that's not right either. Because why did Herod do that? Well, it was for his own personal gain. It was because of the fact that he wanted to maintain his own power. He wanted to maintain his position. He knew the only way to do that was to allow the Roman influence to come in. Jesus is telling his disciples here when he says to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod, to be wary of who we include and why we include them. And we're out of time this morning. It'll give us a week to start chewing on this. Because this was kind of an eye-opener for me when we talked about this over Thanksgiving. It was kind of a gut punch in a way for me to realize that sometimes the people that I'm wanting and willing to include aren't necessarily who I need to be including. And Jesus is, I think, giving us a lesson. That's one of those lessons that's initially hard to see. What is he talking about with being wary of the leaven of the Pharisees and Herod? And why does he follow that up with this pointed, remember how many loaves I used? Remember how many baskets were picked up? Remember how many loaves I used? Remember how many baskets I picked up? He was telling them a message that as Jews, they should have and would have been able to understand. And in our culture, it's not quite so easy. It's easy for us to just read over this and just, I don't know what that's saying to me. But we'll pick up here next week. And I did all the talking. I apologize about that. But any questions, comments before we close up? And again, we'll pick up here next week and take this.
Because Mark wasn't talking to the Jewish audience.
Right.
So what in the world, like, if I was a Jew
Yes.
in the room, or if I was a Gentile, I'd be like, I don't care.
Yeah.
I mean, because why would they? It would mean nothing to them. So it's almost strange that there isn't more explanation. Like when Matthew repeats it later, that is to a Jewish audience. They might have
Yes.
gotten it, but this audience would not have, they would have been like us, what? So it's funny that he doesn't spell it out a little bit more.
Good point. Good point. Any other comments, questions? All right.